Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Hakumei in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, Part 2, Retreat. For a moment, the only sound that came between Kiba and Naruto's stare-off was that of Naruto's heavy breathing. Kiba's hands were shaking and Hakumei looked like it was somewhere between growling and whining. Finally, Naruto opened his mouth. "Took you long enough," he said. Naruto would have liked it to have sounded more defiant, but really he was only managing exhausted. "I was kind of offended when you didn't recognize me when we met. Did all those times we cut class together and read manga mean nothing to you?" That last bit sounded better. More mocking and less tired. Kiba glared at him. "Why are you attacking your own home?" He nearly screamed. "What did they tell you? Did they tell you that you weren't cared about? Everyone looked for you. We started a war because of what IWA did. If you surrender and come back now, Danzo-sama will accept you. I know it. You're tough, and you're Konoha-nin. Yeah, and that's all that matters, isn't it?" Naruto said, "But there's a problem. Some of my friends aren't Konoha-nin. I'll have to pass." For a minute Kiba looked confused, but slowly he seemed to see what Naruto was saying. "So, you're really an enemy," he muttered. Sorta, kinda," Naruto said with a shrug. "I'm against Danzo. You'd be too if you knew what I do." "Shut up." Kiba all but screamed, leaping for an attack. Honestly, Naruto didn't have time for this. He was already late due to trying to figure out how to fight Sora with Kiba by causing problems. Maybe another time when they could fight to their heart's content. He jumped up, ricocheted off a tree and managed to get behind Kiba, kicking him in the back and sending him forwards into the horde of cage bunshin waiting. "Get dash! Shippuhu no Naruto Renden!" Naruto and the bunshin yelled, each landing a kick on him, sending him into the air until a final above kick drove him to the ground, next to Sora, completely unconscious. It was an old technique, but useful. He had made it after Tsunade showed Sakura a combo that she thought she might like, and he had made a bet with Sai and Sasuke that he could copy it without training. He'd won. Naruto landed next to Kiba and sighed. "I'm sorry, Kiba, I really wish I had the time to tell you everything. Even though I don't think that you'd believe me right now," Naruto sighed. There was a growling from behind him and Naruto turned to face Hakumei. He looked like he was ready to kill. "I didn't hurt him that bad." Naruto protested, "He'll be a little sore, that's it." Hakumei didn't seem that impressed. He ran forwards to attack, but the Naruto clone poofed the moment Hakumei bit down. "Hakumei!" yelled Naruto from somewhere, the echoes distorting his voice. "Tell Kiba I'm sorry, and that if he wants to learn why, he needs to learn about when the Sand-Aim died. Tell him that we weren't ever kidnapped, and to look out for Yumi. She shouldn't have the Sharingan if she's his age." Hakumei growled, and Naruto was pretty sure that whatever he said was pretty offensive, but he turned around and jumped off. He had a group of meet up with, and the designated spot wasn't that far off. Sasuke was waiting rather impatiently when Naruto finally got there. He was glaring over at some poor harassed-looking apprentice medic with frizzy hair and her eyes hidden by large glasses. She only looked more nervous at the glare, which immediately focused on Naruto. What had happened to his mask anyway? "Where have you been?" he growled. "Finishing up with Kyuubi Sora and having a run-in with Kiba," Naruto said. "Where is everyone?" "Nishoku and Hara have just brought in some prisoners and allies, I guess." "I don't know where everyone else is," Sasuke said, crossing his arms. "Even Tsunade and Jiraiya haven't been heard from." Naruto blinked and started to feel a bit of panic rising up inside him. Tsunade and Jiraiya should have been here. Yeah, they got distracted by the pain known as Orochimaru, but it shouldn't have taken so long. Same with the others. Everything was all wrong. "Let's find Nishoku and Hara and look for the others." Naruto began but was interrupted by a loud sound as what looked like a ball of sand floating in the sky over the Hokage monument exploded. "What the dash?" someone started. "It's Sabaku," Sasuke whispered. "Let's go!" Naruto yelled, breaking into a run. They were joined by the figures of Sakura and Haku, both with their masks still on. Both got behind Naruto. Did you hear anything about why Sabuka would send a signal? Haku asked. Naruto shook his head. Gaara had said that if there was something really bad about to happen, he'd warn them. Naruto had told him that if he sent a signal, they'd regroup and find him to see if they could help. What could have happened at the monument that Gaara thought that he needed help? Gaara was like a one-man demolition team. Then again, even he couldn't look at directions at once, and if he was too tired, his sand wouldn't protect him anymore. We'll see soon enough, Naruto said. Arashi, you and Nishoka see if you can find the others. Hara and me will go directly to see what's wrong. If you can't find anyone in 15 minutes, forget it and get to the monument. They'll come when they can. Sasuke nodded and he and Sakura dashed off down one of the other streets. Kisame had gotten stronger over the years. By joining Akatsuki, he had been practically guaranteed an increase in power. He had always been one of the most powerful of the group, but now, Zabuza was starting to feel outclassed. This was ridiculous. He had trained in hopes that this day would come. Now, here he was, running around a flooded street like some kind of idiot genin trying to keep his head from being cut off. It was downright embarrassing, but he couldn't get too angry. He couldn't lose control. That was what Kisame was waiting for. The moment that Zabuza lost his head figuratively, he'd lose it physically. So, things were mostly clashing swords, and trying not to have something shaved off by Kisame's deeply creepy, somewhat sentient sword. It feels like a training session, don't you think? Kisame asked. Like old times. Zabuza replied by trying to get in a position where the hole in the sword was around Kisame's neck. Sorry, the nostalgia was getting to me. Kisame dodged the blow and dashed towards him, running over the water. It really was like old times. How many training sessions had been similar to this? Well, he wasn't going to lose this time. It didn't matter if Kisame had sacrificed his soul to that weird dark god that he'd heard some travelers whispering about in some inn or other. Zabuza had been in worse states before. After all, he'd had to kill every single one of his peers once. Kisame was easy compared to that. Even if there was more emotion this time around. It had been easier back then. When there had really been nothing between them. Not as much as other nations believed. Everyone had known what was going to happen, and even at that age, there was a self-defense in them not to get too close. Kisame and he had once been close. Once upon a time, he'd been just like that stupid Haku kid. Willing to do anything for his adopted family. Swords met, and Zabuza felt himself being pushed backwards. He shoved harder, ducking his head to avoid Kisame's sudden move to shave, and kicked out. Kisame let go and jumped back. Something exploded above the two of them, and they both jumped at the same time, using the debris to jump their way to one another, both clashing and jumping apart when they had the chance. Face it, Zabuza, Kisame said, grinning. You're not going to beat me. You've gotten a little rusty running around as an assassin for hire. Or was it the little girl? Zabuza jumped onto the building and crouched, waiting. How did he know about Isaribi? Akatsuki's got the best information network in the world. Kisame seemed to know the question he was asking himself. Maybe if I kill her, you'll put in more of a fight. You were always tougher when you went berserk. He meant it. Zabuza redoubled his attacks, jumping up, swing the blade, kicking out, trying to get close enough to get a good attack in. That's more like it. Kisame said cheerfully. And Zabuza soared. With a roar that was almost more like a scream he charged, but some part of him that was usually dormant woke up. The thing that had allowed him to fight and win in the genin exam. He dashed forwards again, like he was going to attack, but jumped backwards, landing in the debris in a crouch and waiting for Kisame to follow him. He did. Jumping down with his sword going straight for Zabuza's head. And Zabuza jumped back at the last minute, and swung his sword. You know, we're going to do this all day, Kisame said with a grin. And Zabuza hit the edge of the roof that Kisame was standing on, making it crack and slide back while Zabuza charged. Dishonorable to the last, Kisame muttered, trying to block the assault that Zabuza immediately began and moved to gain his footing, but Zabuza wasn't letting him. That's rich, coming from the guy who always said that a ninja had no honor, Zabuza snarled. There was a sudden explosion from somewhere, and Kisame looked up for one moment. Zabuza guessed that he knew what that signal meant, but that one instant was all he needed. The hole in the center of the blade was suddenly around his head, and with a jerk, there was a gush of blood that sprayed Zabuza, and Kisame's body fall into the water that he had made. The sword fell with him. Whatever kind of living thing it was could probably swim. Everyone, Miyako, it's done, Zabuza muttered. It was amazing just how empty those words sounded. The last two Otonin were starting to look desperate. With two of their members dead, their invincibility wasn't quite so clear anymore, and they were starting to look as if the idea of the fact that they too could die had just occurred to them. Kimimaro straightened, still feeling slightly dizzy from the girl's attack, but he could see again. But there was one small problem: he was starting to get tired, but any worry that he was feeling didn't show on his face as he stared the final two down. He disengaged his arm from the twisted lance that was the flower of the attack. He wasn't going to need it anymore. 2 to go, he said softly, dashing towards them both. The two-headed boy who was constrained by Kimimiro's other whip disappeared with a pop as a bone aimed directly for one of their foreheads hit it. Seikon, you KON, you filthy scumbags. Don't leave me here. Teiwa screamed, following up with a few good swear words about his ancestors. Then she stopped and prepared herself for a fight. Fine. I'll go myself. For a moment Kimimaro wasn't sure what to do. He knew that betrayals weren't all that uncommon, but this was the true first time he'd seen one done, and it had been so utterly without any interest in his teammates. The idea was almost sickening to him. She put her flute to her lips, but Kimimaro was faster. Dashing forwards, he cut the flute out of her hands with a bone sword, and before she could react crushed it with one foot. End of the line, Otonin, Kimimaro said. Get it over with. Teiwa snarled, or are you going to rub it in my face? Actually, I'm going to take you prisoner, Kimimaro said, taking out his spine again and with a flicking it around her arms. You appear to be highly ranked, so you might know some interesting information. Do you think that I can't take torture? The girl smirked. Kimimaro stared at her, his own mask hiding his own smirk. You have never been trained to take the kind of torture that I'm going to put you through. Now, start walking, Kimimaro said. You're sparing me because I'm a woman, aren't you? Teiwa continued to shout. I'm sparing you because you're the last one standing. Now, be quiet and march, Kimimaro said. Not mentioning the fact that he'd chosen her for last for a reason. There was a rush of motion, and Kimimaro looked up to see a bird made of ink coming down to meet him. Sai was naturally guiding it, but he was surprised to see the girl clinging to him as if her life depended on it. Wasn't she that Ino girl who'd tried to possess a puppet? Had Sai suddenly developed hormones? Somehow, Kimimaro seriously doubted it. It was more likely that circumstances had forced him to take her with him. After all, she was from an ally's family, and right now, allies were hard to come by. The ink bird landed next to them and dissolved as Sai jumped out with Ino still attached to him along with two young children that Kimimaro hadn't really noticed before. Hello, Hakukan, Sai said pleasantly, you've done a pretty good job cleaning out here. I'm glad you just got done, but I think we're about to have a problem. I think that those of Kainan can finish up anything that you're doing. If you make another bird, and allow me to take my new prisoner to Shizuan, we can talk on the way, Kimimaro said. Sai nodded. Sounds good. Why don't I use a snake so that you can use your spinal cord as a means of killing people again, Sai said, and Kimimaro could tell that he was smiling. There was a meeping sound from Ino, and Kimimaro watched as she turned an interesting shade of green. Oh, come off it, you spoiled princess, Teiwa spat, you're not being tied up with it, so what do you have to complain about? Because I don't want to hear about it either. Ino shot back, turning red. Now, ladies, Kimimaro said, it's not mannerly to squabble like that. He had a very satisfying chain of swear words out of Teiwa. You're enjoying yourself too much, Sai said, cocking his head. Probably, Kimimaro said, hopping onto the bird and dragging Teiwa with him. Sai nodded and followed, and the bird took off carrying all of them. Ino and the children clung to one another in something akin to terror, while Teiwa sat on her knees, straight-backed and glaring at everything that moved. Only Sai and Kimimaro were standing to see what the invasion had done. Konoha hadn't been a bad-looking place, but the three-way battle had changed that. It looked like the civilian sector was all but demolished, and one of the walls had been completely taken down by a giant snake. Close to the center of the city, where the Hokage building had been, a giant two-tailed cat, obviously the prisoner Naruto had met, was being attacked by a group of ninja. Yet, the damage wasn't what Kimimiro's attention had been attracted to. There was a battle going on near the Hokage monument, and from the explosions and shouts, it was unlike the others. Other ninja were running to that place as quickly as they could, and Kimimaro could see what looked like black shapes jumping down from the heads of the Hokages. It looks like Danzu had a counter-attack planned, Kimimaro said. Have you warned the others? No, I haven't found them yet, Sai said. You were the first one. We have to tell them all. They'd thought that by killing Danzu in the first move, Konoha would be too disorganized to put up this kind of fight, but with Danzu still alive, it looked like their attempt to take Konoha had failed. Apparently, everyone agreed that a healed Orochimaru was a very, very bad idea. Jiraiya and Tsunade were busy in one part of the street, but they had already used up plenty of chakra in the fight with Orochimaru. Also, summoning here would probably be even less helpful. Kakashi and Hayate were fighting together, guarding her against what looked like a pretty tough opponent, but at this point, Hinata couldn't tell whether he was Root, Oto, or Suna. After a while everything just blended together. Hinata straightened up and positioned herself to fight. Sorry, Kakashi said, do you still need time? No, Hinata said. I think he's healed, but he's not going to regain consciousness for a while. I hope I didn't do anything bad to him. Thank you for protecting me while I was busy. You've done a good job. Field healing is always difficult, Hayate said, then he charged with his blade at the nin who was about to throw a barrage of kunao at them. Where's Hanabi? Hinata said, looking around. She was nowhere to be seen. I'm right here, Oni-sama, Hanabi said, appearing from where she was hiding in a tree. I was trying to attack from a difficult-to-find location. I know that father wouldn't approve, but my training isn't complete, and I thought dash. That's very clever, Hinata said, really unsure of what to say. Usually people went to Tsunade or even Sakura for praise. Or Naruto. Never to her. It was honestly completely unnerving. There was a rush, and Hinata spun around to see Sakura and Sasuke, without his mask for some reason, land a little ways in front of her. Jess Hoku! Sakura cried, where's Raisin? I don't know, but he should be close by, Hinata said. Sasuke looked around, and the crimson cherry non fell on the form of Orochimaru. Hanabi let out a small gasp that Hinata doubted had a whole lot to do with the fact that he was looking murderous. She shouldn't have been that surprised, after all, it wasn't that strange that they would have stayed together, all stupid rivalries aside. Dead? Sasuke asked. I'll tell you later, Hinata said. This is Hanabi, my sister. She's going to come with us. Ask Tsunade to take her back with her. We have to find the others. Hara and Shibuya have already joined Sabaku to help with the counter-attack. We don't have enough time to babysit, Sasuke said, giving Hanabi a bored look. Hanabi glared at him. I am perfectly capable of fighting, she said stiffly. No, you're not, Sasuke said. Now, go and talk to Tsunade. I don't have time for you. Hinata sighed. Being that Naruto was gone, Sasuke was in charge by default, but that didn't mean that he was right. She wished Naruto was here. He would have understood. I'm sorry, Hanabi-chan, Hinata said, turning away from Sasuke deliberately. Maybe he's right. We might be killed out there, and I don't want to lose you now that I've found you again. And it was true. It was strange, that even though they hadn't seen one another in so long, Hinata wanted to be able to talk to her sister again. Hanabi glared at Sasuke and nodded to Hinata. You won't die, Oni-sama. Hanabi said suddenly, but, I'll listen to you and go with Tsunade-sama. We'll see that she gets to her, Kakashi said. Now go and find Raisin. Hinata nodded and took off. Neji had trained like crazy for this invasion, but he wasn't doing as well as he thought that he would. Yes, he wasn't easy to hit, but still, he would have liked to have not been able to be hit at all. Even when going against a big group, he was stronger than most of them. Also, it was kind of disturbing to fight next to Lee and Guy. Even wounded and tired, Guy was a formidable fighter. If only he wasn't so enthusiastic in his words and attacks. What was worse was that Lee joined him and seemed honestly shocked that Niji wasn't joining them in their weird friendship poses that seemed vaguely disgusting to him. What was worse was that they kept looking at him as if he was the weird one for not joining them in their actions. My eternal rival. Lee yelled, while we may be rivals, it is not wrong to enjoy the flames of youth while we have this moment of unity. Why him? He was almost thankful when a barrage of kunao and other various things distracted him, and he rushed off to meet the thrower. There was a sudden explosion above him, and Niji looked up to see what looked like a giant ball of sand. It was floating in the air, completely suspended and occasionally exploding out with enough sound to alert the entire village that it was there. That was Gaara's signal. Niji quickly dispatched the large man who had tried to get him into a headlock, and started down the street. The flames of youth have at last kindled deeply within your heart. Lee crowed and took off after him. Yosh, Lee. Guy called, let us continue on our crusade to save Konoha from the evil that it has accidentally brought on itself and turn it to a land of youth. They were either completely insane or utterly brilliant. The problem was that Niji wasn't sure he even wanted to know. Gaara wasn't happy by the time Naruto and Haku arrived. He could tell by the way that Gaara was holding his arms. When Gaara was worried or something, he held them tighter. It wasn't any wonder that he was so stressed. He was almost the only person who was fending off what looked like an onslaught of masked Rootnin, and he was getting tired. Most of the Nara clan was either wounded or retreating or dead. There were some medics trying to get at them, but mostly they were outnumbered, outclassed, and out of luck. Gaara was pretty much acting as a wall to allow the others to back up, and he looked like he was dangerously close to using his secret weapon. He could, after all, for himself to sleep. Shibuya, he sighed, relief clear in his voice, good to see you. The others should be coming soon. Arashi and Nishoku were sent to find the others, Naruto said. For a minute he was surprised when he saw the three hostages, but then he recognized two of them as Gaara's siblings. He nodded once at Gaara and set to work himself. Naruto threw a barrage of kunao that quickly multiplied and exploded, making group pause for a minute, but after that moment they kept going. Well, Naruto wasn't really expecting them to start to retreat after throwing a few exploding kunao. Naruto pressed his fingers together. Tajuyo Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. He yelled. The explosion made everyone jump as the Kainan members there saw more Kage Bunshin than they had ever thought was possible, and even Root looked a little unsure of itself when faced with what was essentially an army of identical masked figures. Reinforcements have arrived. One of them shouted. Another one hit it, and since apparently Bunshin couldn't make one another explode, the one who shouted just looked embarrassed before joining in the charge that all of the Bunshin were making towards the Root members. Naruto noticed that Danzo wasn't to be seen. If this was the counter-attack, he wasn't going to be at the forefront, he supposed. That wasn't like him. Has Danzo appeared at all? Haku asked, forming wall of ice to shield a group of retreating nin. I haven't seen anything, Shikamaru's voice said from behind Naruto. He hadn't really noticed him before, but he was there, holding a wounded arm and looking tired but alive. I looked for him, but I couldn't see anything that looked like him, even masked. The man giving orders in the back isn't built right, so I'd assume that Danzo is somewhere above us, preparing another wave to attack by. So, I guess this means we've lost, Naruto said. Part of him didn't want to accept it. There couldn't be a way that they could lose. Surely they were right? And the right thing always won out, didn't it? What had they done wrong? Maybe if they kept fighting, they could all die. Yujito was starting to get tired. Running around, tearing down buildings and fighting giant snakes wasn't easy. Particularly since the Nibi wasn't all that interested in being helpful. Just like a cat to pretend to not want to do something that she really wanted. They were so obsessed with making people respect them and looking good. Even to the point of denying themselves. When she couldn't hold the form anymore without losing control, Yujito preformed the seal to force the Nibi back and looked at the 10 Rootnin who were against her. She smirked slightly and took out 2 kunao. Well, Maybe you'll give me something to do, she said, smirking at them. I still have a brat to smack for getting me into this, so I can't have you kill me just yet. She dashed forwards, weaving through the group and stabbing them where she could. This wasn't even the second group, so it wasn't too hard. Still, after summoning the Nibi, she was pretty tired. It wasn't surprising that she didn't notice that one of the Rutanin wasn't as weak as she seemed to be, and when Yujito stabbed her in the stomach, the blood that came out was slightly too dark to be real and that she fell in a way that allowed her to throw something. Still, by the time she realized and reacted, she would have been badly injured had the man in the red and black fashion statement appeared and grabbed the woman's hand. You should pay more attention. Even if you believe that they are weaker than you, Itaka said. Who are you? Yujito said, crouching down. Since you were freed by Zabuza, who is working with my little brother at the moment, I am your ally, the man said. It was creepy how he didn't have much emotion when he spoke. Wait. Black robe with red clouds. It had been a rumor that B had passed to her about a group that was looking for Jinhiraki. What was the name again? It had something to do with Dawn or something. Oh, yeah, that was it. Akatsuki. Yujito wasn't one to bother with an explanation in this kind of situation. She attacked, throwing two kunao that were deflected and almost hitting him with an exploding tag before winding up on the ground, while the person in question somehow managed to kill off the surrounding Rutanin with nothing but a kunao and a fireball. I assure you, I will not attack you, the man said, there is no reason for this. We have the same enemy at the moment. She didn't believe him, but it wasn't like she had a choice either. If this guy had wanted to kill her, she'd be dead. We have to hurry to the Hokage monument, the man said. Danza will attack from there if he has made it his new base of operations, and we must hurry if you do not wish to meet my partner. Yujito could guess that this guy didn't, so because she didn't know what else to do, and because if she didn't the guy probably would have just knocked her unconscious and dragged her along, she followed him. All in all, it wasn't a particularly wonderful way to meet someone. It was not easy to fight and carry around an unconscious man at the same time. Orochimaru had better have a seriously good story in payment for this. How had B managed to get himself in this position, and just how much of what had happened before was his fault? Well, Tsunade was going to find out. If she managed to get out of here. At the moment, she was busy keeping her slugs with enough energy to help heal everyone they could find, and get the retreat to begin. Shizun was already starting to round up as many as she could with Hanabi, and Anko and Irika were both proving invaluable. Anko had her giant snake that could move around at a very shocking rate, and Irika was moving behind her. He was surprisingly brutal with killing his opponents. Quick and efficient, but still rather ruthless. She supposed that living under Danza would leave marks on anyone. Other than Anko. She hadn't changed much from when she was Orochimaru's apprentice. That had been why she had been paired with him. She had been too brutal and too competitive to work with a team, and Orochimaru had volunteered to train her. He'd said it was so that he could work with her to control herself. Really, he'd just thought she'd be a good experiment. Or had he? How long had he been under that seal? That didn't matter. What mattered was the retreat. Everyone, fall back. She called to what looked like an all-out brawl right in front of the hotel where the guests were staying. They didn't even know what side was what. We must initiate our plan to evacuate to Area 15. She'd always known that this rebellion wasn't a good idea. Now that they'd lost the only thing that would have won their battle, she had to make sure that enough people got out with their lives. And where was that idiot? Jiraiya! Tsunade yelled just as an explosion rocked the building next to her. You hollered. You take sleeping Snakey, I need to warn the others, Tsunade said, almost throwing Orochimaru at him. What about my spy network? There are still some of them here. Jiraiya somehow managed to sound slightly whiny when he said that. They're not fighting, are they? Hopefully, they're smart enough to stay as spies and keep themselves alive without you to tell them to. But we're in charge of this mess, and we have to give the orders. Now, come on. Alright, fine, but we need to give orders to the kids too. They're going to be in the thick of it. I'll get to them. You focus on Shizun and getting the others out. I'll tell the kids to separate from us and go the long way round. Tsunade nodded. By the time that the others arrived, Naruto was on his third Taijuyokage Bunshin, and he was starting to feel tired. Danzo's strategy seems to be to simply tire us out, Sai said. He will continue until he believes that we are weak enough to crush. I didn't know that there were so many Rutenin, Sakura moaned. She was fighting 5 of them at once, weaving, dodging, and occasionally landing a fatal punch, so she had a right to complain. Naruto was a little busy using formations and charging Raise-Nons, but he could tell that Sasuke was still looking around. Probably for his family. We keep going until we get word. Shikaku yelled, we are the only ones here, so we have to hold them off. It was something that was easier said than done. Even with the protection of Gaara's sand, which was whirling around, attacking anyone who was in Gaara's line of sight, the Nara clan, those that were still fighting, was having trouble. Their style always needed protection, and without their more or less now traditional allies with them, they weren't doing as well as they usually did. Still, since this was the brunt of the counter-attack, and if they retreated it would cause those people who were fighting in the other parts of the city to suffer for the fact that they were completely unprepared. Also, Naruto could make out some parts of Suna's force here too, still fighting. Right now, the fact that there were 3 groups was, finally, having some good parts of it. Neji was next to him, setting off one of his spinning attacks and holding his own fairly well, other than the kunai that was sticking out of his shoulder and the fact that he was breathing hard. Hinata was doing well too, but she was more working in the background, breaking up genjutsu that had been cast on some of the Nara, looking for weaknesses in people's chakra and shouting instructions to Gaara about where to attack, and sometimes attacking with poisons. She looked undamaged, but exhaustion was starting to show itself. The 2 green-clad things that Neji had brought with him were really helpful though. Even if Naruto had some trouble understanding what they were talking about and what an eternal rival was. The older man was already badly wounded, but he was still kicking, literally, and the younger one was certainly strong. Why hadn't they met in the exams? Kimimaro was somewhere in the thick of things. Then he would jump back and attack from a nice distance. He was starting to look tired though, and he was starting to cough a little, a sure sign that he was going to be unable to fight pretty soon. Haku was probably having the worst time of it. He really had trained more of one-on-one fighters, but he was doing his best, as well as managing to put some kind of pad on Niji's shoulder that was numbing the pain and stopping the bleeding until Sakura could look at it. He had made a mist that was really proving useful at this moment, but Naruto noticed that Haku was limping slightly. There was an explosion behind Naruto, and he turned around to see the giant toad coming towards them with Jiraiya on its back. Shibuya, you should have summoned something. Jiraiya called. Yeah, but it's hard to fight on the back of a toad. Naruto yelled back, and you had Gamabunta. Jiraiya looked like he had someone with him, but Naruto didn't know who the person was. He only had an impression of long black hair. Had he just picked up some random, unconscious woman? Naruto sure hoped not. Anyways, I'll hold them off for now. You all get out. Area 15. Go the long way. We're all splitting up. But Naruto started. Go on. Jiraiya-sama, the Nara clan Shikaku began. Is going to be wiped out if you don't get going. All the clans are badly damaged, but you all need to get going. Shizun's already getting the wounded out, and Tsunade's warning the others. There's nothing we can go keep as many of us alive as we can to hope that the added problem of Suna will help our retreat. Everyone knew that Root was divided into its 3 groups, but Jiraiya had never actually seen the third in action until this day. Root was mostly formed when Konoha was peaceful, after the Kyuubi assault and the Second War. He had to give Danzo credit, these guys were tough. Was that guy using Hyuga attacks? Hayashi wasn't going to be thrilled about that. He wasn't going to be able to do it alone, so he summoned Gamahiro and Gamaken. Just in case. After all, he did have Orochimaru's dead weight on him. I'll do my best, despite my clumsiness, Gamaken said, bowing his head. How many times did Jiraiya have to tell him that they'd both been drunk? There was no reason to take it to heart the way he had. The owner had forgiven them both. It wasn't like most giant toads were good dancers anyways. Don't worry about that, Jiraiya said, Our job is to keep the main force busy while everyone gets a chance to get away, then we made a break for it. Such a brave ninja, Gamabunta muttered. He who fights and runs away dash, Jiraiya began wisely. Lives to see the light of day, now shut up and fight. Gamabunta snarled. Jiraiya's hair began to spike out as he dashed forwards to meet the first guy head on. Oh. Me too, me too. A new voice said, and Jiraiya looked up to see that Zabuza had joined him. The demon of the bloody mist hoisted his dripping sword over his shoulder. His eyes were somehow unfocused. I just had an anticlimactic battle, so I want some release. You guys should amuse me, he said, his muscles tensing. Isuribes with Shizoan, Jiraiya said, sure you don't want to join her. Zabuza smirked, when there's so much fun to be had here? Oh, I saw the cat girl and someone else heading this way, so we should be having some reinforcements. It was the best news Jiraiya had heard since this whole mess started. So they ran just as the fresh wave appeared, and from the first onslaught of jutsu, Naruto knew that this was the group who Danzo really considered rude. Everything else had just been grunts to be killed and tire out his enemy. These guys were using high-level attacks, and Naruto looked back to see Jiraiya attacking with everything that he had, summoning 3 toads that Naruto hadn't even seen before. For some reason, now that Kainen was starting to back off, Suna and Oto seemed to be focusing exclusively on Root. Not that it was doing much for them. Naruto could see a whole lot more of them dead than Root. He couldn't really see any of the groups. It looked like they had been holding them off. Most of the streets were either abandoned or they were filled with people who looked too busy for them to interrupt. There were brief moments where it looked like a fight was about to begin, but Gaara, still holding his siblings, sent a wave of sand in anyone who stood in the way. We split up here, Shikaku's voice cut through Naruto's thoughts and he turned to see the Nara starting to run down another street. This will lead us to our rendezvous point. Keep going straight. You kids'll be alright, won't you? Naruto nodded, yeah, we'll be fine. Baa-chan and Aro Sennin planned out what would happen and all. He scratched the back of his head nervously. Oi, Naruto, Shikamaru called, it was good to see you again. Take care of yourself. You too, Naruto said. I shall see you soon, my eternal rival. The younger of the green spandex guys said to Neji, who looked somewhere between annoyed and amused. Yes, Lee, and both of you shall enjoy the glories of your rivalry in the springtime of youth. The older one yelled. Guy-sensei. Lee. There was a very sudden change to a sunset out of nowhere where the two men embraced. What are they talking about? Kimimaro hissed to Neji. I have no idea, Neji shrugged. It sounds disgusting, Hinata mumbled. Two men embracing in the sunset, it looks far more disturbing than I would have ever thought. Sakura said. Maybe it's the spandex, Sai said. Both parties dashed off. They had almost reached the wrecked main gates when the scream came. Sasuke. Sasuke knew that voice, and he stopped in spite of himself. There standing behind him, flanked by members of the military police and Uchiha Yumi, stood Uchiha Mikato. She looked different than the last time he'd seen her. Then her eyes had held nothing but cold indifference. Now she was looking at him with a kind of shock. It's you, from that time, she whispered, why didn't you tell me? Her voice was low, but it rang in Sasuke's ears as if she had screamed them. Hello, Oka-san, Sasuke muttered. I don't know what they told you, what lies they fed to you, but come back. I promise, you won't be punished for it. We'll speak to Danzo-sama, Mikato said, stepping forwards. Ever since that day a month ago, Sasuke had asked himself what he would do if he was faced with this. He had told himself that he would turn his back on them easily, but now, when faced with his mother, even knowing that this was just as much of a political move as a familial one, it was hard to do it. Arashi. It was Naruto, standing at the top of the wall, beckoning him. Hurry. Sasuke bit his lip. Sasuke, come here. Mikato ordered, I am your mother. Sasuke, this time it wasn't a shout. Sasuke turned around to see Sakura standing there, waiting for him. She wasn't begging him. She was just standing there, and she would have stood there even when Jiraiya had to back off. If he didn't come back with them, Sakura would have allowed herself to be captured. She probably would have killed him once they were in prison though. That moment lasted longer than Sasuke would have liked, particularly when he had constantly said how he wasn't going to be associated with the Uchiha. He had called a blood feud. And now, he was faltering. He looked at his mother, and his eyes fell on the smirking face of Yumi. Yumi, who had nearly killed Sakura and was only interested in this because he happened to be from the same clan. His mother, who had said all those years ago that he wasn't important and who hadn't even recognized him. But, she was his mother. "Forgive me, Oka-san," Sasuke said, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "What?" Mikoto took a step forwards. "I won't be coming home again. It's too late. This is my life now," Sasuke said. "I am not Uchiha Sasuke. My name is Arashi no Sasuke. The one who will break the power of the Uchiha clan." "I told you that he had taken his brother's path," Yumi said, stepping forwards. "His brother is here. I saw him. Then I will show him the error of his brother's ways," Mikoto said, preparing to dash forwards. Sasuke didn't need to turn around to know that the rest of Hakumei had doubled back and was preparing to attack. What happened after that was something that none of them expected. Sasuke had seen some of the Hyuga clan, but they had been busily fighting among themselves for the most part. He had kind of written them off as completely unimportant. He was shocked when Hyuga Hayashi jumped from a building, alone, and commenced an attack. Now, Sasuke had seen Niji and Hinata's Juken, but this was different. This was almost like a dance as he spun, barely even touching the man nearest him before he collapsed, coughing blood. "Hinata!" he called out, "I know that you're there. I recognized you the moment I saw you." He spun again, dodging Mikoto's attack and Yumi's whip. "Go! Get out, and take Hanabi with you." "Oh, Ota-san," Hinata whispered, "why?" For a moment he looked behind him. Sasuke saw his and Hinata's eyes meet, and she looked away. Sasuke didn't have to be told twice. He turned around and ran, trying to ignore the sound of his mother screaming for him to stop, and the knowledge that for the sake of his daughters, Hyuga Hayashi was about to be killed for treason against Konoha. Chapter 32, Part 2, Aftermath. It was a sign of just how desperate Jiraiya was that he didn't even bother to ask what Uchiha Itachi was doing helping them. He just kind of accepted that he was there, and that he was very useful. Jiraiya supposed that he'd ask questions later. If they survived long enough to ask questions later. The fact was, with the unconscious Orochimaru as something of a handicap, the arrival of Itachi, Zabuza, and that cat girl romance slightly cliché, but still, if done right, was a blessing as far as he was concerned. "All right, we just need to hold them off for a little while. Long enough for everyone to get out. Then we need to get out ourselves," Jiraiya ordered when the three were close enough to hear him. "That sounds so easy," the cat girl said, rolling her eyes before dodging a barrage of senbon heading her way. Zabuza hadn't bothered to wait for orders, he'd just jumped to the attack, slashing happily anything that so much as moved in his general direction. Itachi nodded once, much like the Umbu captain that he had once been, and proceeded to attack, summoning a Hanzenka and using the pause to come closer and attack with a katana. Was it just him, or was Itachi saving his energy? Not that Jiraiya had ever ordered the guy around, he just seemed to be holding back for some reason. There was a small explosion and Jiraiya caught the kunai that had flown towards him between two fingers and sent his hair on the attack as two high-ranking Rutanin ran towards him. The hair struck one of them, and he disappeared. Great. Bunshin. There was a pop above him, and Jiraiya saw the third nin falling down towards him. Jiraiya jumped back, his hair forming a shield around him, prepared the hand signs for an all-out assault on the three of them. At least Tsunade wasn't there to laugh at him. The boy looked at his two fighting teammates, wondering if they would manage to live through the test to be a genin team, let alone a real mission. Noise. Shouting. He sat in his apartment room, brushing some black hair out of his face and listening to the silence of the empty house. Surely, if it wasn't for the war, he would have been with his parents. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right, they hadn't even been killed by an enemy nin. Just a stray mine. It had been such a simple, silly way to die. It wasn't fair. A battle? What had happened? They had poisoned him. It was kind of ironic since he had taken the Hebai jokes and turned them into his personal style. It just was too perfect that he'd die of poison. Snakes weren't immune to their own poison after all. Don't fall asleep. Stay with me. The girl's voice was desperate. I've almost got it. There was a scream from somewhere nearby, and the boy gritted his teeth. Just go, that idiot needs your help, he muttered. It wasn't like she was going to make it in time anyways. The girl glared at him, and for the first time he noticed that she actually was quite determined. Not just the privileged girl that he'd always seen and treated her as. Maybe he'd misjudged her. He'll be fine, the girl said, her voice certain, and it gave him hope. We both know that he's pretty much invulnerable. You've beaten him up enough times to prove that. Some grassnin isn't going to be able to get through that thick skull. He laughed weakly. He could see the flashes of his teammates' white hair as he fought, yelling unnecessarily as he attacked. Idiot, didn't he know that he was just giving away his position? If he lived, he'd have to tell him off, maybe show him how to do that attack without killing himself. Something was wrong. That had been the first time that he'd looked at his teammates as more than just a necessary evil. When he'd seen the reason why they divide them all into cells. Because, you have to have something, or else you lose touch with reality. It was the first time he'd noticed that other people are struggling too. That he wasn't the only person who had suffered, that he couldn't say that he'd suffered more than someone else. That, he wasn't alone. His head hurt. Why? Why hadn't he been chosen? Why had a man half his age been named in his place? What did Minato have that he, one of the Sunin, didn't? How could Sarutobi-sensei just destroy the dream that he had had since he could walk so easily? Minato carries the will of fire, hadn't he? Hadn't he always defended Konoha? How could he? The man needed a walk. It was a bitter thing to watch the man who you had seen as your father crush your dreams. He would stop by to see his teammates soon. Even now that the Genin team had been disbanded for years and they all had taken teams of their own, they still were teamed together in missions. It wouldn't be easy for any of them. Particularly when Minato was Jiraiya's student. He was going to be torn between wanting to celebrate with his student and wanting to do something to help his old friend. The man sighed. It was nearly splitting. He had to take, protect, destroy Konoha, find the others, kill them, warn them. There wasn't much left of the western part of the city after the Kyuubi attack. It had all but destroyed the wall on its way, and there were still bits and pieces of the chakra floating about. And now there was the issue with the child. Minato had left them with a Jinhira key and the city wasn't sure if they should celebrate, hail the child as a hero or kill it. This wasn't Kushina or someone who they knew. This was an unknown child who might turn on them. At least so they thought. Many believed that the boy would be driven mad by the voice of the monster, others thought that it would be able to devour the soul of the child, since it was nothing but an infant, and only a few were in favor of keeping the child alive. It was understandable, but it didn't change what it was. Also, some very sadistic part of him just thought that it would be interesting. The boy would change things, and he was always interested in that. He was so busy with his own thoughts that the figure came on him out of nowhere. Really, it had seemed to appear out of the dark like a ghost. He only had time to turn and jump back when. Jiraiya's voice? An attack? Like a snake that had been woken, he lashed out violently, his tongue slashing through the thing that was making the sound, but trying to avoid Jiraiya. He stood up, his vision still blurry and the taste of blood in his mouth. Nin in black. Threat. He wasn't sure who he was, or what he was doing, but the motions somehow came naturally to him. Almost on sixth sense alone, he dodged the kunao and kicked. It was fluid, natural feeling. Something moved behind him. White. Jiraiya. His friend, enemy, teammate. Not a threat. He was attacking from the other side. Back to back on a strange surface. Orochimaru was either not quite conscious or not quite sane. Jiraiya wasn't sure which. Still, he was moving, and standing back to back with him was at least better than having to defend the idiot. Hopefully, he would be able to tell the difference between friend and foe. Raise non. Jiraiya called as he summoned his student's weapon and pushed it into the stomach of the man who'd just managed to jump on Gamabunte's back. The ball of swirling energy caused the fabric of the root uniform to come apart as the man fell. If he had survived the fall, he didn't survive Gamabunta jumping on him in his attack on the army. Gamaken was also cutting through, but one of Orochimaru's stray snakes seemed was attacking the toad, probably more out of the traditional rivalry than anything else. "Oi, Hebai-kun, call off your summon," Jiraiya said to Orochimaru. Orochimaru turned and blinked at him once but didn't say anything. Yeah. There was an explosion and Jiraiya's mind went other places. They just needed to hold out a little longer. As a Jinhuriki, Yujito was used to some pretty bad situations, but facing down an army with nothing but one of the Sunin, some psycho with a sword who probably would have happily charged the whole army alone, and some guy from an organization that was supposed to be tracking her kind down for some unknown reason was pretty ridiculous. Still, she supposed that she could still be in that cage. It was clear that they were acting as a buffer, so that the rest of the, whatever they were, could get out with their lives. Honestly, Yujito didn't expect to live to see the next morning. Root just kept coming. When one was killed, 3 more seemed to appear out of nowhere, and the Hokage himself hadn't even bothered to come. Then again, Danzo rarely actually fought. From what Yujito remembered from various scraps of information that she had found, Danzo more or less only appeared in battle when necessary. It was unusual, since a ninja leader usually was at the head of a battle, but it had been done during the time before villages. At least, that was what B said. And B was usually someone who should be counted as being right. After all, he learned a lot of things from his brother. The Akatsuki guy suddenly appeared next to her. He was holding a katana and looked strangely tired. "Yujito-san, are you able to summon your tailed beast again?" he asked. Yujito tested her levels of chakra, while throwing a kunai with a chain for 3 exploding tags attached to it towards a cluster. They dodged, but the thing exploded before they'd gone too far. "I'm not sure. Nibi's not the easiest thing to summon up at the best of times. I can keep her out for about 5 minutes, tops. Attack aside, if we are not called on to retreat, both of us will need to unleash our strongest techniques." Somehow, she noticed for the first time that they'd been moving closer and they were suddenly back to back, almost surrounded. As they both prepared to spring apart from one another and attack, ignoring the fact that the sword guy was running around, slaughtering everything that moved without even thinking about getting too deep into the army, a signal flare erupted. It looked like a fireball. "Suzuki." The Akatsuki guy breathed. Yujito didn't care who it came from, obviously that was a signal, and they were going to get out. "Yujito-san, help me take Zabuza-san. We might need him." "Why are we going to need that psycho?" Yujito asked, watching Zabuza running the wrong way. "He's high-ranking in his abilities, and knows a great deal about how Kiri's political structure is formed. And, unlike my late partner, he will most likely say something about it." "All right, fine," Yujito muttered. She supposed if she was going to be changing allegiances, she might as well be in a well-informed and powerful group. The bit about insanity wasn't all that important. After all, they all seemed to be slightly insane. A Jinhuriki who believed in friendship, a bloodthirsty swordsman, a guy who used to be on the side of some creepy group, and a bored Jinhuriki who was thought to be dead. It kind of worked, she supposed. Hyuga Hayashi had recognized his daughter and his nephew from the moment that he saw them. It had been a few days after the break while people waited for the official exams to start. They had been walking together and passed by him. Had it been anyone else, he would have thought that the stiffening of their bodies would have been due to the fact that they recognized him and were nervous, but their faces were too obvious. Hinata did not look just like her mother, and she didn't even look all that much like him, and Niji looked more like his female cousin Hikari than he did either of his parents. Still, Hayashi knew them. Everything in the way that they held themselves, and the way that they moved. Everything spoke of training to use the Juken. So, he was able to guess that the 6 children who had disappeared and who had started the war had returned. So, at some level, he had been mentally prepared for the attack that was coming. Hayashi couldn't conceive of any reason for them to be here for anything that wasn't a full, all-out attack on the city. They hadn't revealed themselves, and, While Hayashi didn't know why they were going to attack, he couldn't bear to face his daughter that way again. So, he would be silent. He hadn't planned on dying. Still, there were worse things, he supposed, than dying for the sake of his family. Particularly when Hanabi, who idolized Hinata, had suddenly disappeared just when the small rebellion was starting to die down. The Uchiha clan must have finally realized that one of their attackers was actually one of their own clan members, since they had all come to collect him. Well, if keeping them busy would allow Hinata, Hanabi, and Niji to escape. Hayashi attacked, forcing Uchiha Hiro to his knees, coughing blood, and managed to graze Uchiha Takashi, who jumped back, but started to look like he was in pain. It would hurt more the more he moved, even a light touch was enough to cause tremendous pain if not to close a chakra point. The whip appeared to Hayashi's side and he spun, trying to capture it in the sudden vortex of chakra. Hakusho Kaiten, he said softly. No matter how good Yumi was at controlling the metal, she couldn't hold on to it, if the sudden sharp intake of breath was any indication. It also forced those members of the Uchiha military police who hadn't been hit by the attack and tossed against a building to hang back. Get out of the way, Hayashi, Mikoto snarled, that is not your child anymore. She's simply an enemy of your own home. For one moment the mother and the father stared at one another. Kushina would be ashamed of you, Mikoto, to see you become the worst things about the clan you grew up in. Then again, she wasn't always the best judge of character, so I suppose that nothing to be surprised about. How dare you? Mikoto hissed. Kushina died as a hero to this village, sealing away a monster into her own son. You are more than willing to let an enemy who attempted to destroy this village go free because one of them happens to be your child. Don't you dare preach to me about how Kushina would feel. I suppose that has always been the only difference between us. When all is said and done, I can never sacrifice my family, no matter what. Hakusho. Mikoto was blasted off her feet, hitting the side of a small dango shop with a thud. He spun around to deflect the second whip before Yumi could reach him. The young woman narrowed her eyes at him, but Hayashi could see that she was breathing too hard to be normal. She had already been through an attack that had overwhelmed her, and Hayashi had been saving his strength. You know that you're simply delaying the inevitable, Yumi said. They will be found. Konoha is no longer in any position to chase after a small team. This attack has drained the city of several good ninja, and shown that we can be attacked. What's more, many people saw Uchiha Sasuke. They knew that another of the Uchiha, one who supposedly was killed by IWA years ago, is alive. And why is that, and what happened to Sasuke? The village is going to have to focus on rebuilding its defenses before it even dreams of chasing its new missing nin. It would be a harsh blow in a way. Konoha's fighting force would be weakened and people would question if they had fully investigated when they had attacked IWA. If they could just get away. The stare-off continued, quiet and controlled, between those of the Uchiha clan that remained standing and the head of the Hyuga main house. The Sharingan was powerful, but Hayashi wasn't going to attack until they were, rendering its ability to see 5 seconds into the future meaningless, and the copying ability was completely useless if they didn't have the Byakugan. It was a complete standoff. At least, it had been. There was almost a ripple as Danzu appeared. He was limping slightly, and his bandages were still on, and he seemed to be alone. The two stood in silence for a moment, gauging one another. Danzu hadn't been in the battle. He would have claimed to have been too weak for that. But he had come here personally, probably after being messaged that Hayashi had gone insane. Danzu, Hayashi said calmly. I see you've weighed the life of a traitor daughter to be worth more than your own home and everyone in it, Danzu said, leaning on his cane. Hayashi would have dearly loved to tell him to stop acting and just attack. I wished protect something that I have always been unable to keep, Hayashi said calmly. I suppose that I can buy them a little more time. Perhaps, Danzu said. He moved forwards, and using his good hand began. Futon, Shinkarenpa, Danzu said, and the blades of wind began to form. Hakusho Kaiten, Hayashi said. He could deflect the attack all day. At least until exhaustion set in. Doton, Shinjuzanshu, a voice said under him, and Hayashi had enough time to look down and see the white mask looking up at him as he was dragged into the ground, just in time to see another slice of wind coming straight for him. Hayashi didn't look away. He didn't flinch, but somehow, the thing passed through him and the earth lightened its hold. Climbing out, Hayashi prepared to continue, not sure what was going on until he saw that something had changed. The streets were empty other than the man facing him. It was himself, only maybe a little younger. Hayashi said, looking at his long-dead twin brother. Hayashi smiled. Are you surprised that I would be the one waiting for you? He asked. Hinata Hanabi Hayashi said, looking back for a moment. There was a gate there, maybe. Hayashi shook his head. It doesn't quite work that way. They'll be fine. You saved them. Besides, there's still things to do on this side. You'd been surprised at the work that the Sandaime has me going through to see if we can finally convince the Shinigami to cough up the Yondaime. And so, Hayashi stepped forwards and, side by side with his brother, walked towards home. Tsunade watched the mass exodus carefully. She had sent up the signal, so now all she had to do was wait for Jiraiya to come, and she wasn't going to leave without him. She'd even send Shizune ahead with the mix of prisoners and actual rebels. Though the oddest member of the group was the Suna Eldercho, who had quietly marched along in a way that said that either she'd gotten senile since they last met, which was highly unlikely, or she had been here for something different and got interested in something, which was likely. Tsunade would have to worry about that later. Now she had Jiraiya to wait for. There was an explosion from somewhere, and Tsunade saw the figure of Gamabunta coming closer before disappearing. Jiraiya dashed up to her, followed by Orochimaru, some Uchiha kid, Zabuza, and some blonde. Don't ask, Jiraiya said with a shrug, they're helping. At the moment, that was about all the recommendation they needed. Tsunadeheim. Orochimaru muttered. Orochimaru. Tsunade said softly, then almost jumped back as he collapsed, falling into her. She and Jiraiya caught him and looked at one another. I think the sounds of the battle kind of woke him up, but there's some damage done. Hopefully, he'll wake up again soon so we can see, Jiraiya said. Tsunade-sama. Isaribi called, running up to them, there's no sign of Hakumei. Tsunade looked back, then she squared her shoulders. They know where to go. We don't have time to see where they are, they'll be fine, she said, taking a breath. Oh, please let them be fine. Please don't let the curse of that necklace claim someone else. The Uchiha suddenly looked up, and Tsunade recognized the robe. Akatsuki. She said, but in an instant, he had vanished. No one so much as dared to look back as they jumped through the forest. No one talked either. They were all straining to hear if someone had followed them. Naruto had a good idea that Hinata's father could probably handle a lot, but eventually, he'd only bought them so much time, and they had to move as fast as they could and make as few marks as possible as they went. What was harder that, because they were likely being followed, they had to make the trail as erratic as they could, meaning that they had to jump from tree to tree in random direction and occasionally have one of them just break off and going in a different direction. So, it wasn't until almost midnight that they sat down and allowed themselves the luxury of conversation. Sasuke started a small fire in a cave and Sakura did a genjutsu over the thing so that anyone passing by would think that it was just a normal, empty cave. That was bad, Naruto said after a while of everyone staring at the fire in complete and total silence. That was, really, bad. Hinata nodded mutely and then, softly at first, but louder and louder she started to cry. Naruto tried to pat her on the back, but she recoiled from him. It was my fault, it was all my fault, she sobbed, if it wasn't for me. It wasn't your fault, Hinata, Naruto muttered. Hayashi-sama made his decision, and it wasn't something that was split second, Niji said quietly, it wasn't a mistake that he was there and he saved us. Maybe he was following us. He had been mostly staring at the fire, not responding to anyone. Lost in his own thoughts. But why did he wait so long, Hinata whispered, why didn't he talk to us? I spent all this time thinking that he hated me. I guess we'll never know, Haku said. But, he was the bravest man I've ever seen, Kimimaro added. The others nodded, and were silent. It seemed that the only way that they could show any kind of thanks, respect, or honor to a man who they hadn't even gotten to see die, but knew had done so to save them, was not to speak and to let Hinata sob and Niji think. Finally, when Hinata had cried herself out, and she was only hiccuping a little, Naruto put a hand on her shoulder. She smiled at him a little, a watery, forced smile. When I was 4, my father would train me every day. No one else would be there. Just us. It was before my mother died. Before everything. He was always gentle with me. But then, he just stopped. I thought I resented him, I thought. Naruto nodded, and Hinata started to sob again. Hinata finally had lain back and fallen asleep. Chakra exhaustion, physical exhaustion and mental exhaustion all had taken their toll on her, and Niji had gone off. He would talk if he wanted to, but at the moment, Sasuke thought he was more sorting through his own mixed and confused feelings. In the end, he was the only one awake. You holding up, Sasuke? Sasuke jerked his head up to see Naruto looking at him. Why, I thought you were looking after Hinata, Sasuke said, getting control of himself quickly. Haku gave her some tea. She's out like a light, Sakura shrugged, coming up and sitting down. Sasuke gave a wary look around them, but Gaara wasn't there, he was on guard duty, and the others looked like they'd fallen asleep. At least he didn't have to worry about everyone seeing him. And seeing his weakness. It's nothing. I'm fine, he grumbled. He wasn't going to start whining. Particularly not after Hinata had lost her father. Yes, he'd just lost his, and the sudden realization made him feel sick simply because he really didn't feel anything. Yeah, fine, Sakura rolled her eyes, you know, you've been through a lot too. I haven't, Sasuke muttered, I'm just weak. Why did I even pause? I knew better. I'd said I was going to rebel, I was facing your mom, Naruto said, hitting Sasuke over the head lightly. I'm not really the guy to talk about moms, but I don't think I'd have run away easily. If it were mine. Besides, it didn't change anything. They would have been right behind us. You're not to blame for Hayashi's death. If I'd attacked, if. Sasuke muttered again, and found himself being hugged by Sakura. Dummy, she muttered, as if that would have helped. Yes, you hesitated, because you're not a monster. She's still your mom. And somehow, even though they never said the things he wanted to hear, it was enough. Even if it didn't make the problem go away, and it didn't promise that the next time that he was faced with something like that he wouldn't freeze, it was at least something. Sasuke didn't want to freeze up. He wanted to get revenge on Yumi for Sakura, and he wanted to make good his feud. When he was younger, Sasuke had told Jiraiya that he'd wanted to show his family that he was just as special as his older brother was. Now, he had to choose something else. That goal was gone. His father was dead, his brother was in Akatsuki, and his mother would probably attack him if they saw her again. Sasuke had failed his first goal, but he had made new ones. I promise, you guys, Sasuke said, I'm going to get stronger, and I'm going to beat Yumi, and I'm going to crush that clan. I won't falter again. For a moment, he thought he saw concern on the others' faces, but he assumed that it was only a shadow cast by the dying embers. Anyone who knew sound knew that the Fuma clan had been the blood, sweat, and tears of it. They had built this country, even when Orochimaru hadn't been there, and at some level, they had always believed that they would take it back. It wasn't surprising then that when news came of the disaster in Konoha that the rebellion followed so quickly. Karen hadn't really thought that it was going to go that far. It wasn't surprising that they'd lost. Not really, Karen had to admit that. The best fighters had gone with Orochimaru, so when the rebellion had come, there really hadn't been much of anyone to fight. That crystal user who Karen despised with all the hatred a 12-year-old girl could muster had taken a lot of the experiments off and run. Presumably in hopes that Orochimaru would come back. That had left all the rest of them to the mercy of the victorious Fuma clan. She'd never believed that Oto could fall. Well, she'd been proven wrong. Now, as a prisoner, she had to wait to see what they were going to do with her and with the experiments. Karen wasn't a kind girl, but at some level, she wasn't overly thrilled with people like Jugo, who really was more of a danger to himself, getting killed. Still, what else was there to do with him? Orochimaru had wanted him for some kind of experiment that had failed, but he was simply dangerous. She wouldn't be killed, She was sure. Her abilities as a censor were unmatched by any ninja. Though, she had to admit, she had been pretty lucky not to have been selected to accompany Orochimaru-sama to Konoha. Oh, it's not fair. She whined at the Fuma guard, who'd long gotten annoyed with her and was still ignoring her. Why did I have to get stuck here? Most of the prisoners also ignored her, though a few of them glared at her, and one of them, a white-haired kid with very sharp-looking teeth, chucked a fishbone at her. Oh, shut up, Karen. Hojiki Suijutsu, an experiment who'd only been there for about 2 months and was therefore too mouthy for his own good, yelled. You were loyal to Orochimaru, what are you whining about? She hated the feel of his chakra. It was wet and slippery. Just like him. Some girl with orange hair scowled at Karen, and Karen flipped her hair. You're confident, she said. Karen smirked and arranged her glasses, of course. How could I die? The girl glared and stormed off, running towards a man a good deal older than her, who she obviously had a crush on. How cute. The man was talking to her in a low voice, and Karen could see the carrot top glance over her way. She smirked at the annoyed expression on the girl's face. Arashi-sama says that we're going to let you live, the girl said in an irritated voice, but you're under my supervision, so if you set one toe out of line. Karen's glasses flashed. Oh, this was going to be fun. Suijutsu snicked, so, it's you, me and Jugo all together. Oh, this is going to be fun. Jugo. Karen blinked. Suijutsu? Maybe execution wouldn't have been so bad after all. Camping wasn't easy. Even though most of the defectors had been young and there hadn't been many young children, it was still hard for Tsunade and Jiraiya to set up a genjutsu big enough for everyone to fit in and not have someone accidentally walk out. That wasn't to mention the amount of Tsunade's time was taken treating the wounded. She wished that Hakumei were there. Even the ones who weren't good at medical jutsu were at least able to work quickly. As it was, she only had Shizuan, Isarabi, a girl named Ino, another girl named Tenten, who'd apparently decided that this was a good time to run away from home or something, and the few medics who'd fled with them to help. Oh, and Jiraiya, but he was more trouble than he was worth. The prisoners were at least being quiet. Well, the Sand siblings were being cooperative, and their teammate seemed to understand that if she didn't go along with things, the other two would cause her trouble. The sound prisoners that Hakumei had rounded up were all surly, but there wasn't much they could do about things. The other Jinhuriki, Yujito, had volunteered to patrol to make sure they weren't followed. Tsunade didn't trust her, so she'd sent Shikamaru and Chuji with her. If she tried anything, the Nara could easily capture her before she got too far. Even better, Yujito didn't know it. And it kept them from standing around worrying about their parents and getting in people's way. Because of the amount of wounded, Tsunade had had to separate everyone who needed a medic into groups, those were hurt, but only needed a little bit of treatment, those who were badly hurt and needed attention, those who would die without medical attention at that very moment. Most of the work involved her having to oversee Shizuan or hold her breath and close her eyes as she used medical jutsu. It wasn't a surprise that everyone was so injured. Not really. What was a surprise was when Cho had started to help out. As she had to make poisons like any puppeteer, she was good at making drugs, and she making painkillers and disinfectants and both applying and giving them to the others. What are you doing here, Cho? Tsunade hissed to her as they passed. Blunt and rude as ever, slug girl, Cho cackled, I was here to see how things were going to turn out, but now I've found something else more interesting. You realize that you're helping a group that attacked Tsuna's nin, don't you? Tsunade asked. What was this woman up to? Cho was dangerous. Even now when she was old and got tired easily. She was smart, and she hated Konoha with a passion. No, I'm helping a group who attacked the village that I hate the most, and they just happened to contain some old enemies that changed sides. Suna was stupid to make the attack, and I advised against it, but that fool of a Kage wouldn't listen. Besides, I speak on behalf of his children and make sure that they live. I do have some loyalties. And she knew that no fool in their right minds would try to capture her. From what Tsunade had heard through Jiraiya's almost all-knowing spy network that she wasn't that much weaker than she used to be. She'd been a monster when she was younger. It was odd how circumstances brought together old enemies. And you're only interested in the children of a man who you rejected as leader. Tsunade scoffed, at least give me that credit. I'm not senile yet. Cho cackled a little, so, I suppose both of us have held on to our wits, haven't we? All right, I'll tell you. You're not going to leave me alone until I do anyways. I got interested in a little girl with pink hair who cared enough about a bystander to cut her chances of winning in half. Maybe it reminded me of me. She walked off, cackling again, and Tsunade blinked. Sakura? Cho had taken an interest in Sakura of all people. She should probably be proud. Her little girl was going around getting allies. Or whatever Cho was going to be. Tsunade supposed that beggars really couldn't be choosers, and Cho hadn't used poison on the subjects, and she wasn't in the position to afford distrust. This was truly the worst place to be in. To be trusting Cho of all people. It was late that night when Tsunade finally got to see Jiraiya, sitting in his tent, writing something down with Orochimaru laying there unconscious on the cot by him. Oto's had a rebellion, Jiraiya said as she came in. Who cares? Tsunade asked, scowling at him. She wasn't in the mood for political games. She'd just nearly thrown up all over one of her patients because he'd been bleeding badly. Hemophobia was a really stupid thing for a medic nin to have. Well, aside from the people there, it's going to change things. Ibiki wrote to say that Konoha's been pretty harshly hit. It can't afford to send any of its troops in pursuit of us because if they do, they'll be open for an attack by someone else. Oto and Suna are both busy with problems. It appears that no one knows where the Kaze cage is, and people are starting to be afraid that he was dead before he even talked about the invasion. We should be able to make a clean getaway. There was a moan from the cot. Both Jiraiya and Tsunade turned around, both of them ready to attack, as Orochimaru opened his eyes. For a while he stared at the ceiling, but then he looked around, and his yellow eyes fell on them. Jiraiya, Tsunade, where are we? What are we doing camped out? He muttered. Tsunade jerked her head at Jiraiya who came a little closer to him. Tsunade noticed that his hair was a little more spiky than it usually was. What's the last thing you remember? Jiraiya asked, trying and failing to keep a light tone. The Kyuubi's attack was over, the Yondaime is dead, his son is now a Jinhiriki. The shrug was clear even though he sounded tired. I went for a walk. And that's it, were we attacked? He looked angry, but it was a familiar look of irritation that Tsunade remembered. The anger of a man who thought that he was too good to have fallen for such a basic attack. Had it been, before, she would have reminded him how the basic attacks were sometimes the most effective, and that would have started out some debate or other with Jiraiya chipping in when he wasn't busy with something. But it wasn't before, and Tsunade was sure anymore. How could she just let go? After all this time, all this anger, she was supposed to just forget it? What if he was acting? What if this was a trick? What if? Orochimaru looked between the two of them, taking in the mixed emotions on both of their faces. Something happened, didn't it? He asked, tell me. What happened when I was unconscious? Did IWA go after the boy or something? It was so logical. So like him. Jiraiya finally moved. He leaned against the wall, still slightly out of striking distance, and grinned at him. Orochimaru gave him a suspicious look. You've got so much to catch up on. Jiraiya said brightly, you were kinda evil then, so maybe you don't remember anything, but don't worry, Tsunade and me are behind you. Don't just decide things on your own. Tsunade yelled before she could even help herself. And then, just for 1 second, it was old times. As much as it ever would be. Kiba felt like he'd just been used as Yumi's whipping boy and then had Sora practice with that freaky claw of his on him. And his mom hadn't even gotten to him yet. He'd been found unconscious but beaten up by reinforcements, and his mother was trying to convince Danza that the fact that Kiba had been spared meant that the children weren't completely lost to Konoha, and if they sent out a team after them, they might be able to reclaim them. Once she was done with that, she'd get to him. Shino was gone, either captured or defected. His clan was, as usual, not telling anyone anything. They were a pretty secretive bunch at the best of times, but now, they weren't even talking to Danzu. Kiba had seen a small group talking together, so he had to suppose that they were debating on where they were going to stand on the issue of Shino before doing anything. Uchiha Mikoto was talking to Danzu as well. Apparently, Masaru was Uchiha Sasuke. He should have recognized that stupid smirk. Then again, he should have recognized a lot of things. Naruto had to think that what he was doing was right. He couldn't have really turned against Konoha. He hadn't been saying how they needed to be crushed or whatever. Just that, he didn't understand something. Kiba growled. He'd hated it when Naruto tried to be mysterious when they were kids. It was the most annoying thing. With his injuries there wasn't much that he could really think about other than that either. Akamura was still recovering, and he had no one to talk to. The only thing he could do was eavesdrop on people's conversations. At least he'd gotten to hear a kind of funny thing between some guy and his wife about the guy's habit of putting things into one container. She was saying how the last time someone had asked for an aspirin, she hadn't been sure if the pill would cure the head, dry up their cold, make them regular again or sedate them. Yumi? Are you alright? Kiba almost sat up in bed as he heard his sister's voice. Of course, Yumi's voice was calm. How did Hana know Yumi? I don't know, you've been through a lot, what with Itaki appearing again and all. Don't talk about him, Yumi's voice had a definite edge to it, filthy coward. Now his brother's going down his path. Poor Mikoto-sama is distraught, and to add Fugaku's death. You'll find them. You'll find both of them. You're the best, Yumi. Hana's voice was strained. Kiba knew that sound. It was the one when she was lying, but trying to comfort someone. But, Yumi, why would Sasuke turn on you? Itaka was Akatsuki, and Sasuke. Who cares? Yumi asked. Well, it's odd. We always thought that Sasuke and the others were taken by IWA, but we never found any trace of them, not even in S-class records. Nothing. Maybe they really weren't lying and it wasn't even a branch. Why would the Sunin of all people betray us? If we could find out, maybe we could tell Danzu-sama and Dash. And what? Yumi's voice wasn't sharp, it was more bored. I don't know. Repair Konoha's reputation. Hana, you're a good friend. Could hear the shrug. No, you're my best friend. You always have been. You've always been the closest person to me since Shishi died. I am grateful, you know. You've always done what you can for me, but now, I'm going to have to ask you one last favor. What's that? Kiba heard the sudden snap, but he didn't really know what he was. Give me the power to destroy Itaki. Thank you, Hana. I will never forget what you did for me. You'll be remembered as a hero. I promise that your name will grace the memorial stone. Kiba listened for Hana's reply, but there was nothing. Slowly, he began to realize just what he had heard. Bile rose to his throat. He reached to summon the nurse, to summon anyone, but Yumi's voice spoke again, effectively cutting off anything that he had been about to do. Goodbye, Inyazuka Hana. For your sake, I will not harm your brother, no matter if he is listening. Your death alone is enough to grant what I want. A scent wafted towards Kiba, something like smoke, but lighter and more metallic smelling. It was only then that he threw up and managed to call the nurse, yelling at them to look for his sister. Hana's body was discovered with her neck snapped, and Uchiha Yumi was nowhere to be found. Chapter 33, Part 2, Waiting. It probably wasn't the best idea in the world to take a break at a tea shop, but Hinata needed it. Granted, she was doing better since the last night, but she was still quiet and kept her head down. They all agreed that maybe some tea would pick her up a little. They were all quiet as they sat in the booth. Sakura and Hinata drank their tea in silence, while Naruto munched on some dango and Sasuke glowered down at his undrunk tea that was getting cold with enough passion that Naruto was surprised that the thing didn't reheat itself. Alright, guys, Naruto said, setting down his stick, I know no one wants to talk about it right now, but a lot happened yesterday. We have to go over it. Hinata nodded once, but she didn't say anything. Niji gave her a worried look, but cleared his throat. There isn't much for me to report. The only thing that ended up happening was that Rock Lee, Guy's student, joined up with us as well as Hanabi. There was apparently some kind of rebellion in the Hyuga clan, which is why they weren't present. Naruto nodded. I ended up taking one of Oto's more powerful nin hostage, Kimimaro said. She's with Tsunade. The others aren't a problem anymore. So, they were all dead. That it? Yep. Haku and I got into a fight with some Oto nin. The ones from the preliminaries. We captured them all, Sakura said. Oh, and Kabuto was a spy. Why am I not surprised? Niji asked, rolling his eyes. Because he was obvious, Sasuke muttered. My older brother appeared during the fight with Yumi. He was wearing the Akatsuki uniform. The table was silent. Naruto had managed to forget about little detail. Still, he'd helped them, right? Maybe they wouldn't have Akatsuki on their tails right now. He didn't think that they were really in the mentality to take that as well as a loss and the death of Hayashi. Sasuke took a deep breath before continuing. That means that he has to have had a partner with him. I didn't see them though. Maybe they split up somewhere. I never got the chance to talk to Itaki after I saw him the first time. At any rate, if there's anyone going after us, it's going to be them. Actually, it didn't seem that anyone was after them by this point. Maybe Konoha was in such a state that it couldn't afford to send anyone to chase them down. It was too busy bracing for a possible attack from one of the other counties, which all had a vendetta by this time. Naruto really hoped so. He was so much in thought that he didn't really notice as someone walked into the shop and sat down in the booth behind them. Okay, so I beat up Sora a little and ran into Kiba. That's about it. What was up with the rest of things? Sasuke, you were with Shizune. There were some wounded people, Sakura said before Sasuke could answer. Everyone had been in place at the time, so it helped, but we weren't really expecting what happened. And, of course, there were the sheer numbers. Sakura sighed. So, really, they didn't know what had happened. As a rule, no matter how safe you believe that you are, it is a poor idea to discuss matters like these in a public place, a calm voice said behind them. All of them had stood up and braced themselves. Kimimaro already had a bone in his hands. Then the man who had been sitting behind them slowly stood up and faced them. He wasn't very tall, and his long black hair was tied into a long hanging ponytail. He had an almost pretty face, but 2 lines in the skin kept it from looking feminine. Actually, he did kind of look like someone. The man calmly reached out, and poked Sasuke in the forehead with 2 fingers. Hello, Sasuke, he said. Aniki, Sasuke said. The immediate aftermath of the 3-way battle was mostly concerned with figuring out who was dead, and who had defected. The problem was that a large portion of the Jounin, along with a healthy chunk of the old Umbu was gone, and so things were slow going with the sudden drop in numbers. Root was more interested in dealing with its own wounded than anything else. They had never been all that interested in the city itself. The civilians were, for the most part, left to try to find one another and bring their wounded to the hospital. There was some grumbling, but, at the moment, everyone was too shell-shocked for it to be anything that was close to an actual outcry. Ibiki was, in addition to dealing with a Root shadow, working see who was still there, which was mostly going to the various districts to see about the clans, find who was still there, who had left, and which districts were now mostly abandoned. The Uchiha were being very quiet. The news that one of their attackers was Uchiha Sasuke, son of the late Uchiha Fugaku, had spread like wildfire, and the clan, which had a reputation for extreme loyalty to Konoha, wasn't used to people looking at them with suspicion. What was worse was that apparently Uchiha Itachi had been sighted and Uchiha Yumi had vanished, and, from a testimony from Inyazuka Kiba, she was responsible for the death of Inyazuka Hana. The clan was close to the slight suspicion that it had been viewed by all those years ago. What had she thought she was going to accomplish? Well, that wasn't his business. He had interrogations to do on those prisoners who were unlucky enough to be captured. There weren't many of those, and 3 of them were just civilians who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was impossible to contact Kainen, or even any Jiraiya's spies that were still in the city. His movements were being carefully watched by his new assistant, Nico. She was a good assistant, if all you counted was sheer efficiency, but it was clear from the way that she watched his every move that he was under some suspicion, though not enough for the fact that he was useful to be forgotten. He missed Anko already for some reason. It was too bad that she couldn't control herself and ran off with that teacher. Well, with Suna starting to make peace negotiations with Konoha and Iwa showing signs of getting some of its strength back, things were looking more like a stalemate than anything else. Possibly more because of the news that Konoha's attack had been completely unwarranted than anything else. Kumo was backing off, possibly to aid its ally, and right now, everyone was on edge. With a sigh, Ibiki looked over at Mizuki. The man was breathing hard, his white hair falling in his face and his hands trembling. He'd been a poor informant for Danzu, and now Danzu, in the name of security of course, was taking out some of his anger on a man who'd failed to discover the betrayal that he'd been sent to sniff out. "If I'd caught anything," he gasped out. "But you didn't, did you?" Ibiki said softly, "and so, you might just be a spy yourself. After all, we can't be too careful." He smiled, and honestly, he enjoyed the fear a little more than he should have. "I'll kill him," he mumbled. "What was that?" Ibiki asked softly. "I'll kill Irika," Mizuki said, a little louder this time, but with an edge in his voice that made it clear that he meant every word he said. "And what does that matter to me?" Ibiki asked. "Or to Konoha? One dead traitor means nothing." Mizuki snarled, and Ibiki raised an eyebrow. Some part of him was worried that Danzu might just take him up on his word. Hana's funeral was a quiet one, and Kiba was sure that she would have hated it. She was loud, bright, and cheerful. She would have thought that them all standing in front of the white box with her picture on the front was stupid. Kiba could almost hear her ghost saying, "Oh, come on. At least talk about how I used to bite the puppy's back or complain about how I would sing loudly in the shower or something." That didn't make Kiba feel any better, and the weight in his chest was even heavier. "I'll miss Hana," Hakumei said, looking at the picture. "Yeah, she was the best," Kiba muttered. His mother stiffened and looked away. No one could really stand to be touched at that moment, and for a family that was always hugging or hitting or something to be all standing with a good distance between one another was a strange thing. Slowly, as the service ended, people began to drift away until it was just him and his mother standing there. It was so wrong, she shouldn't be dead. She hadn't been killed in battle or doing anything, she'd been murdered by someone she thought was her friend. After everything that had happened in the rebellion, he didn't really see that Kiba would ever be able to straighten things out. First there was Naruto. Naruto the traitor. Naruto who hadn't killed him when he had the chance. Then there was Yumi. Had they been working together? That thought made him clench his fists and his head spin. She did follow him. But something didn't make sense. Hakumei had told him that Naruto had warned him to beware of Yumi. That she shouldn't have a fully developed Sharingan. If they were allies, Naruto wouldn't have done that. Also, why hadn't Naruto killed him? If he was an enemy to Konoha, there would have been no reason for his not killing Kiba. After all, friendship hadn't kept him from attacking his home. There was no reason. Yumi and Hana had been friends, it was clear, but Yumi had killed Hana. While he had listened. Completely unable to do anything. Yumi had mentioned Uchiha Itachi. There had been some reports of someone matching his description, and maybe she'd gone after him. Kiba didn't know much about it, but he was sure that Naruto did. After all, Uchiha Sasuke was with them, and everyone had said that the only person that Itachi had ever had any human feelings towards had been his younger brother. Kiba looked at the picture of his sister, smiling like she never would again, and clenched his fist. He had a lot of work to do if he wanted to catch up to Naruto. Itachi wasn't the most talkative person in the world. Even when they were grilling him with questions, he didn't seem all that interested in explaining too much. Rather, he was drinking his tea, completely at peace with the world, and completely ignoring everyone around him. He wasn't wearing Akatsuki's uniform anymore, rather he was wearing a black shirt and pants that just seemed kind of boring. Naruto supposed that it was a good idea for blending in, but still. At least he could seem like he was on the run or something. "What are you doing here?" Kimimaro asked, his voice level. Itachi drank his tea. Naruto decided that if Itachi wasn't interested in talking then he wasn't interested in waiting for him to do something and buried his face in the ramen that he ordered. "You've avoided being followed," Itachi said at last, putting down his teacup, but you'd still left a trail. If it hadn't be for my covering it up, a bounty hunter or hunter nin would have found you eventually and those whom you had gone to. You have all been archived in the bingo book. What's our rank? Haku, of all people, asked, looking curious. To be, Itaka said, taking another drink. Naruto felt a rush of pride that he tried not to show for Hinata's sake, but even she was looking up for the first time since the conversation had started, but she still looked sick at the idea that they could have been followed. We were a little distracted, Sakura said, looking at her friend. We should have known better. Itaka nodded. You cannot allow that to happen again. No matter who died in the process. His voice had a kind of dull sound, as if he was reciting a lesson. It sounded kind of like Danzu's philosophy. A ninja was a tool, as such there was no emotion that was allowed to be seen or felt. What about? Sasuke started, but stopped when Itaka glanced over at him. But Itaka smiled slightly. I'll explain soon, Sasuke, but this isn't the place for it. It looked like the only person that could get any kind of anything out of Itaka was going to be Sasuke. Naruto looked around the other booths. There weren't many other people there, but he supposed that there could be a spy or something. While waiting wasn't something that he liked to do, and Sai was tapping his foot and looking irritated. Itaka didn't seem like he was going to talk until he was good and ready to. Very suddenly, Itaka set down some money and nodded to them. They all looked at one another, shrugged and followed him out. In a few minutes they were jumping from tree to tree, speeding away from the shop. So, Sasuke's brother, why are you here? Sai asked. He was smiling again, and Naruto was glad that he hadn't decided to be creative with his nickname. I abandoned Akatsuki and intend to seek asylum with the Sunin. It was incredibly odd to be talking to Orochimaru again after all this time. Particularly when he was sitting quietly, listening to the explanation of what he had been doing for the last decade with a very calm expression on his face rather than trying to kill them or perform some kind of insane experiment on them. At the end of the whole, Tsunade was glad she would never had to do it again. So, ER, how do you feel? Jiraiya asked nervously. Orochimaru glared at him. How do you think I feel? He hissed, but then he straightened. I could have done worse. It's probably a good thing that Uchiha Itaka managed to give me a case of specific amnesia involving that jutsu that would have allowed me to change bodies. I suppose my mind was fragile enough that it wasn't too much trouble. From what you've said, that country that I took has a successful revolution. It will likely heal from the damage I caused in time, though with a great deal of trouble, as long as they are not harassed by their neighbors. However, the fact remains that there's nowhere for us to go. Jiraiya grinned at him. That's not quite true, he said. Remember Whirlpool? Orochimaru blinked. It's habitable now? He asked. He didn't sound all that convinced. Well, it was true that from the wars with surrounding countries and the flooding caused by one of the Baijuya, there hadn't been much left of the country, other than maybe a few old ruins that probably weren't able to hold anyone, but after almost 10 years, people had all but forgotten that a city had existed there. There shouldn't be too much of the original problem remaining. The other countries were now trying to kill one another, and the Baijuya had moved on. Tsunade did wonder how it was going to affect Naruto to be brought to the home of his mother, and how it was going to affect the Kyuubi to be taken to the place where it had originally been contained. Before it had escaped. No one was aware just how that had happened. By the way, Tsunade-heim, what became of Anko? Orochimaru asked. Tsunade refrained from cringing. No one knew about Orochimaru's status yet. They assumed that they were keeping him prisoner or something. Not that they were helping him recover. And did she really think that they'd just welcome him back with open arms just because he'd been somewhat brainwashed at the time? Particularly Anko. She hated the man, for good reason. She'd have to mentally prepare him, as much as she could at least, for that meeting. It was some time after the others had gone to bed that Sasuke approached his brother. They had mostly been quiet, but Sasuke noticed that they'd all gone off pretty early, including the unsleeping Gaara and Sai, who tended to keep odd hours when he had the chance. So they wanted to give the two of them some space. Sasuke wasn't sure if he was grateful or just annoyed. Particularly since they were probably listening anyways. They hadn't managed to find a cave this time, so Gaara had managed to make a sand dome, the way that he had when they were much younger. The problem was that they needed to be close to a village for them to have a fire. Since if Gaara made pores for the smoke, they had to be able to look like they came from somewhere else. After all, even if they weren't being followed at the moment, they didn't want to be memorable. This particularly one had separate rooms. Since for one thing, the days when everyone, boy and girl, slept in a heap together were pretty much over, and it gave them the freedom to stay or to find the softest piece of floor that they could and go to bed. Itaka was sitting by himself in the larger room with the fire, apparently thinking about something. "Your friends seemed more than happy to allow you to speak to me," he said as Sasuke came closer. "They're probably listening in anyways. For my protection, of course." "They're not remotely nosy," Sasuke said, glaring back at the one of the rooms. He could have sworn he saw something move. "It's not wrong for them not to trust me. I'd be surprised you'd lived so long if you had," Itaka said. There was a teapot on the fire, Sasuke realized. That seemed to be all that Itaka was willing to do right now. Itaka took a small cup from his pouch and poured a fine powder into it before he poured himself some tea. "That smells foul," Sasuke said at least. Itaka nodded. "It does not taste that much better," he said, taking a drink. "However, it's necessary." "For what?" Sasuke asked. "Patience. First, you were under the care of the Sunin, am I right?" "For how long?" Itaka asked, looking up from his tea. Sasuke shrugged. "Since the spring after we got out. Tsunade-sama ran into Naruto and captured him. We tried to save him or something, and she decided to keep us. After we told her our story." Itaka didn't say anything. He just watched, and Sasuke took that as an invitation to continue. "Danzo killed the Sandaime," Sasuke said. "We watched it. That was why we ran off." "Did you know that the Umbu had been given a tip to watch an area that was far from that playground?" Itaka asked. Sasuke didn't understand, but Itaka continued. "I found it odd, but I did not question them and performed my duties to check anything leaving the city. Later, I checked the paper giving us the order, and I found that there were several small but important differences between it and the Sandaime's writing. But that was not the first event that made me consider foul play." "Sasuke, what do you know about Uchiha Madara?" Sasuke blinked at the same, vaguely remembering a scroll that he'd read a very long time ago. He was the founder of the Uchiha clan in a way. He allied with the Senju clan, and helped to found Konoha. Then he disappeared. Legends say that he fought with the first Hokage, and swore that he'd have revenge. Yes, that's the legend. When I was around your age, I did not believe it. Not until the night that you disappeared. Then, when I was returning home, foolishly thinking that I'd done you a service by sending you out into the world to most likely die, I met a man who wore a strange mask and addressed me by name. He called himself Uchiha Madara." Sasuke looked up in surprise. "How was that possible?" "Uchiha Madara was dead." "That was something of my original reaction," Itaka said, smiling faintly. "He told me that he had been watching me, and he knew that I was powerful, and if I wanted to change the clan, then I should ally with him. I was skeptical, and he told me that he would speak to me again, giving me a time a place, but telling me that if I wanted to join, I would have to prove my loyalty to him." "So, that's why you killed them," Sasuke breathed. He was starting to feel sick again. While he could understand revenge, just killing someone to prove a point made his stomach clench. Itaka shook his head. "No, not quite. I had no intention of speaking to that man again. However, it seemed that fate was not on my side. Shisui confronted me, and in the conflict, he died. Then, when the military police appeared, I had no choice but to leave, and to meet Uchiha Madara. He believed that I had proved my loyalty to him." "But, why did you join?" Sasuke asked, his voice sounding whiny, even to him. "Because of you," Itaka said, taking another drink. "Akatsuki has a powerful information network, and I hoped that I could learn something of you. Even your death. Also, because I hoped that I might be able to undermine their attempts to cause conflict, which I did several times." Sasuke smirked slightly. "And they never caught you?" "No," and Sasuke thought he heard a faint note of pride in his brother's voice. though there were several near misses. Since I had both of the family curses, I had learned to watch my back very carefully. If it hadn't been for that, I would have died. Both, but I thought. Sasuke started. They never told you, did they? I suppose that Jiraiya-sama and Tsunade-sama never knew. The Uchiha family has two curses that defile it. The first is the Mangekyou-shari-nan, which you acquire from murdering your best friend. The second is a secret that the family has preserved for many years, terrified that people would learn. What is it? Tainted blood. Kisame and Itachi hadn't reported back for a while, and Deidara was starting to get smug about something. Maybe the idiot had fallen under the impression that they'd died, and now he could trash-talk the Uchiha without any fear of repercussion. Not that Itachi ever did much other than stare at him and win through sheer intimidation. Sasori found the whole rivalry between the two of them rather tiresome. It wasn't even for some mature reason like art, it was just the fact that the Uchiha had managed to beat him by using his illusions, and Deidara was mad about it. He did have to admit that mentioning that he never had problems with Itachi's illusions and watching Deidara turning red had been amusing though. So, how long are we going to wait here? Deidara asked, leaning against a tree and making a small bird of clay fly around. It was almost peaceful. Until he made the thing blow up. You seriously want to have some hunter nin come looking for us, don't you? Sasori asked, ignoring the smug look on the younger man's face. He was incredibly immature. What was so interesting about things blowing up? Something was only valuable if it lasted. Akatsuki very rarely actually met in person. They usually traveled around, finding information, gaining power. That wasn't to say that they didn't have somewhere to go to. The leader had his own personal little village that worshipped him as a god, and allowed them to come and go as they pleased, but the idea hadn't ever had great appeal to Sasori. He liked power, but he liked it spread out over a long distance. There wasn't a major village in the world that didn't have at least 2 spies it. As such, while Deidara was gloating to himself, Sasori was well aware of what had happened. They are lying low for the time being, he finally said. That smirk was too much to bear after a while. I highly doubt a little revolution is going to bother either all that much. You really know how to ruin the mood, he muttered. They were relaxing in a cave that also worked as one of Akatsuki's many places to rest while on a job. Or rather, Deidara was relaxing, and Sasori was sitting in his shell, waiting for the rain that had started up to pass. If there was a single problem with the modifications that he had done with himself, it was the fact that it was impossible for him to sleep. There was a sudden motion in the distance, and even Deidara looked up to see Kisame coming, looking irritable, along with the complete idiot known as Tobi, and a cloaked figure that he assumed was Itachi. Took you long enough, Sasori said. I ran into a slight problem, Kisame said. An old friend of mine was looking for blood. I'd say he found it. The three-way battle is well known now. Danzu's busy playing politics and trying to avoid a war with Kumo, so he's busy enough that we can continue our activities in the background. Leader wants Itachi to report to him as soon as possible. Tobi thinks that that's going to be a problem. Tobi said, speaking up in that annoying voice that he had. Itachi-san is gone. Kisame-san doesn't know where he is, but we found a new friend. A new friend. Sasori automatically looked over at the figure, who removed the hood. It was an Uchiha, but this was a woman. Her long black hair fell loosely to her waist, which Sasori had always considered a wonderful way to get grabbed, and her face, pretty enough he supposed, was without expression. Deidara narrowed his eyes, likely mentally comparing the woman with Itachi and finding a few immediate similarities. Sasori, Deidara, this is Uchiha Yumi. Zetsu has informed me that she is to join Akatsuki. We've got a long way to go, Naruto sighed as they got up the next day. He ignored the fact that Sasuke was looking more tired than usual. He'd probably been talking to his brother, though that cold look on his face that usually meant he was unhappy about something was there. He'd have to corner him at some point later on and get him to tell just what had happened. Of course, this was forgotten the moment that he saw Itachi emerging from the area sectioned off for the girls. Everyone stared at him. Itachi blinked at the group of guys and walked out, completely calm. He's alive, Sai whispered. We have witnessed a true god among ninja, Naruto said. Even Ero-Sunin would never dare to set foot in that sacred ground. But isn't it kind of disgusting that he just went into the room for a pair of 12-year-olds? Haku asked, biting his lip. The boys stared at him, and Neji cracked his knuckles. Let's see if we can poison some of the ninja puffs. They're inedible anyways. No one would notice, Kimimaro said calmly. Sasuke raised an eyebrow. You guys do realize that he probably had a really good reason for being in there, right? He asked. Like what? Gaara asked. There was a dangerous edge to his eyes. That was so weird, Sakura said as she walked out of the room, shaking her head. She stopped when she noticed the boys but then shrugged at them. Did you know that Itaka just came in here and asked for nail polish remover? What? Neji said. I guess Akatsuki was really big on its members wearing purple nail polish for some reason, Sakura said. Like I said, it's really strange. Anyways, we're all set. Hinata's starting to feel better, but... Naruto nodded. They were going to have to avoid people to the best of their abilities and get there fast. Whirlpool shouldn't be too far, he said at last, taking a deep breath, and stepping into the sun, waited for Hinata to join them so that they could begin. Let's try to get there quickly. Also, we've probably made the bingo book. We're missing Nin now. We're going to have to be careful. There was a noise from the girls' room, and Hinata stepped out. She was looking better than she had the last day, but still a little subdued. She gave a small smile to everyone. It's all right. I'll be fine, she said. Her smile was too large, and Neji was standing next to her, but they had to move, and everyone knew it. At the moment, there is no sign of any pursuers, Itaka said, appearing out of nowhere. It is time to go. Naruto nodded, and motioned to everyone. Perhaps I should make something to leave a trail. Sai asked. He been getting better at that kind of thing. Naruto nodded, and Sai quickly drew what looked like a foot monster, motioning it to move in the other direction. Sai, you make creepy drawings, Kimimaro said. You are not in a position to discuss creepy, Sai said, smiling. Slowly, it looked like everyone was starting to recover from their defeat. Naruto smiled a little at Hinata, she smiled back, but it still looked wrong. Well, not everyone. Whirlpool was a shadow of its former self. Once, the village had been prosperous, thought it wasn't known for its military might. It had been a fishing village that had, through luck, managed to gain a standing force, and even some respect. It had been unfortunate that the village was all but destroyed by both natural disaster and war. The Mizukage had seen the area as a wonderful place to get a foothold that would allow it to attack other small nations and thus expand, and that spring, increased rainfall had made the buildings sink into the ground, and turned the area into a temporary marsh, so the project was set off and never resumed, and thousands of men, women, and children were homeless. Nowadays, the place was just left to rot. What buildings hadn't sunk were in ruins, but the disasters were over, and it was still a good location. At least, that was what Tsunade kept telling herself. In reality, the place looked like a wreck, and it was depressing to look at the ruins of the lives and hopes and dreams that had once been a part of the village. To her, it was like standing in a graveyard, and she found herself wanting to speak in a hushed voice. Jiraiya, naturally, had no respect for the dead. This is a great location. Maybe even for a plot. A young man, on the run from the authorities for a crime that he didn't commit, stumbles upon the ruins of a once prospering village. The only one left is a lovely woman, haunted by the memories of the friends that she has lost. As he stays with her, they have sex, Orochimaru said boredly. No matter how many times you retell the story, it remains the same, they banged. The end. I would have thought that you'd have gotten bored with it by this time. Growing old is mandatory. Growing up is optional, Jiraiya sniffed. So is thinking. Well, they had just started up where they had left off. It would have been sweet if Tsunade hadn't had to listen to it all the way there when she wasn't working with the wounded and consoling those grieving for the dead. The dead. The blonde girl, Ino, was still barely speaking after her father was confirmed dead, and while her mother was working hard with the wounded, Tsunade was afraid that the poor girl would wander off or something. Maybe it would have been better if her team was there, but the other two had their own families to take care of and cousins to mourn. They should have stopped the moment that the surprise attack failed. She and Jiraiya should have surrendered. Tsunade shook her head. It didn't matter. This was what had happened, and she was going to have to work with it. We've already found that the main building has survived most damage, even though it is almost entirely submerged. That might be to our advantage if we're being followed, Tsunade said in a pointed voice. That might work, but there are going to be signs that we are present, regardless. Orochimaru said. Smoke for instance, and signs of hunting. We'll be able to use the civilians for that job, simply buying what we need and divert the ventilation for the fires into areas that are truly without people. Looks like we're going to need some of those skills we learned in the academy that were taught in case the village failed, Jiraiya said thoughtfully. Who'd have thought? We'll send Hakumei to do hunting when they arrive. At the moment, we have to get everyone settled in, and tend to the wounded. Anko hadn't taken the news well. Iruka knew that she had issues with her old mentor, though she tended to joke about it, and make it sound as if he'd killed her pet for experimentation or something. No one really thought much of it or asked questions. The only ones who knew what happened for sure, being the Umbu and the council, had never mentioned it. Ibiki likely knew as well. That man's head was full of nearly every one of Konoha's secrets. Iruka had never asked because he thought that it was rude. The same as he never commented on Anko's choice in using mesh with skin-colored cloth to make her look like she was running around naked. She'd always seemed to appreciate it. Particularly when he'd come to apologize for his rudeness the night that Naruto and his friends had run off. Since he'd never asked, he was surprised when she suddenly appeared at the tent that he had set up and stormed in. All right, I'll talk, but only to you, she said, looking down at the ground. What? Iruka said, looking around. When I was a kid, I was assigned to be Orochimaru's apprentice. Didn't play well with others, and I was an extra kid, so no one really cared that I was being given special treatment. It was the first time that I was treated like I was important. Orochimaru was a hard teacher, but I thought he was a good one. It wasn't easy for a girl to be taken seriously as a kunoichi who wanted to specialize as anything other than support back then, and the fact that he took me seriously really flattered me. I realized my mistake too late. He took me on what he called a training exercise, away from everyone and everything, and asked me if what I would do to help him. She stopped looking down. You said anything, Iruka said softly. I might as well have, Anko said with a shrug. It didn't even get the creepy pedo vibes from that question. I was such an idiot. So, I, in his sick little mind, gave my consent, and then he tested on me. He had made this thing that was supposed to make me more powerful, if I didn't die first. Well, I obviously didn't die. A bitter smile came on her face. I fought back. I refused to die. At first, I was stupid enough to want my dear sensei to be proud of me. Then, when conscious thought was gone, it was because I wanted to live. I survived, sick, nearly dead, aching, and he walked into the room where I had been confined, congratulated me on living, and then told me that I was a failure and he wanted nothing more to do with me. He left me in the middle of the woods to make my way back with nothing but the clothes on my back, in the middle of water country. Iruka winced. She didn't need to elaborate. Just the thought of being 13 and having to walk through that hellhole with a Konoha headband on made him shiver. Well, she'd likely taken it off, but still. Even when it was in one of its rare moments of not being in the middle of some kind of civil war, the area had often been thick with missing nin, as well as families that had never joined a village. You got back in one piece though. Anko smiled. More or less. Slowly, unsure of what he should do, Iruka embraced her. At first, she stiffened, almost like she was going to recoil, but then her arms were around him, pulling him closer, and her mouth was on his, and Iruka pretty much lost track of everything for a few minutes. I won't trust him. Anko whispered in his ear. You don't have to, Iruka said softly, holding her a little closer. It's all right. He was going to say something about trusting him, but her mouth was on his again, and talking just didn't seem important at the moment. It took 5 days, traveling hard, to reach Whirlpool. They'd taken the long way, making long detours and splitting up to leave false trails, mostly on Itaka's recommendation, and since they were dealing with someone who was accustomed to being a wanted criminal, Naruto didn't see a reason to argue with the man. Besides, it gave Hinata time to grieve without people talking to her. There wasn't much time to say anything. They reached the place one morning, as fall was staring to set in. The mist had blanketed the cove where the village had once been built, and for the moment, Naruto couldn't see the ruins of the main building or any other surviving structures. But he could hear the sea at that distance, and the knowledge that this was where his family came from made him a little quiet as they looked at it. "Are the others down there yet?" Haku asked, looking over at Niji and Hinata. Both had the Byakugen activated. "Looks like half the village went off with us," Niji said, smirking. "All right, let's give the signal and come down for our warm welcome," Naruto said, grinning. With a smirk, Sasuke sent a fireball exploding into the air 3 times, and they make their way down. Almost everyone in the camp was asleep as they made their way through the mists, making the camp look abandoned or something out of one of those movies like Curse of the Nikomata that tended to always be in some run-down theater or another. If it wasn't for the sound of snoring from some of the tents and the fact that Niji and Hinata could see that people were alive, Naruto would have been a little scared. But still, shouldn't they have heard something? "You're early." Jiraiya's voice cut into the silence. Naruto turned around to see him standing outside of a large tent towards the center of the camp and waving them to come in. He stopped for a moment as his eyes set on Itachi, frowned, but then seemed to come up with a solution since he moved to let them all come in, ducking under the flap. Naruto found himself relaxing completely for the first time since he'd left the hermitage. He's missed that place. It was pretty roomy, but then it was Jiraiya's tent, and there was a small desk and supplies for writing in a corner. He must have used scrolls to store the things. Only Jiraiya would waste scrolls on carrying supplies for his stupid books. Tsunade was nowhere to be seen, which was odd, since she was usually present when the signal went off. Jiraiya and Itachi looked at one another with the same blank expression, but then Itachi moved, taking out a katana and a few kunao and throwing them to the floor. "I have come to ask for asylum from Akatsuki," Itachi said softly. "I will provide information in exchange." Jiraiya looked at him, hard. "So, you've defected?" he asked, waiting for the nod of approval. "They're going to be looking for you. I highly doubt that they will be knowledgeable of this place, and I doubt that they would be willing to attack as of yet. I caused some difficulties before leaving that I believe will slow them down enough so that our trail is cold by the time that they pick it up." Jiraiya grinned. "Well, you're going to have to talk things over with our lovely head medic, but it's fine in my book. Though if you do betray us, you're dead." It was kind of creepy how his face didn't even change expression when he said that, but the killing intent in the room spiked just for a moment, and Naruto was certain that he'd be more than able to follow up that threat. He turned over to the rest of them, reaching out and patting Hinata on the shoulder. "I heard about what happened to your dad. I don't think he'd have rather gone out another way," he said softly. Hinata smiled faintly, but the expression didn't go far. "I just wish that I'd had the chance to talk to him again," she whispered. "Burn incense. Talk to him that way," Jiraiya said. "Just tell me if he starts talking back." Hinata giggled a little, and for the first time, her smile was more genuine. "Thank you, Jiraiya-sensei," she said softly. Jiraiya nodded, looking up at the others. "Right, now. The rest of you. You have so much work to do. We're going underground. There's an entrance with a few old tunnels that some survivors of the original catastrophe here used, but they're mostly caved in by now. We're working to rework them, but we have to work fast. Konoha's busy dealing with the aftermath of our hijinks, but my sources don't know when Danzo would be able to risk a strike again. By then, I want us to be safe underground with no sign that we were ever here." "You got it," Naruto said. "Good," Jiraiya said, grinning. "Now, there are people who are wanting to talk to you all, so why not look around?" They'd split up, and Sakura was enjoying a little time to think about everything. They'd lost, and Yumi had really made her look useless. She had to do something. She'd said before that she was going to improve, and she knew that it was mostly because she hadn't been able to use most of her real abilities, but Sighing, Sakura kicked a can, sending it flying. Some apprentice to Tsunade. Shizun wouldn't have gotten caught. She would have just breathed poison or something. Well, I was wondering when I'd see you again, a familiar voice said as Sakura turned around to see the old women from Konoha walking towards her. Slug Girl said you'd take your time, but I was starting to worry if I'd die before you turned up. She was here? Good morning. Sakura said, falling on politeness due to not having a clue what else to say. It is, the woman agreed. You have some potential with your chakra, am I right? I have a question, you think you could, I don't know, focus it on, that kin you just kicked. Not sure what to say, Sakura looked over at where it was sitting and focused on it hard, feeling something draining from her. For a moment, something thin and shiny appeared between her and it, but then it was gone. The woman smiled. What was that? Sakura breathed. That was something that I might just teach you, Cho said thoughtfully. It was twilight when everyone met up again. Haku had been quietly talking with Isaribi, while Zabuza was watching from what might have been considered a safe distance, but probably wasn't. Kimimaro had been mostly looking around, talking to a few people, and once stopping to annoy his prisoner. He seemed to really get a kick out of it, though Teiwa didn't seem to realize that swearing at him only made him kind of want to annoy her more. Hinata and Niji had been fairly quiet, but Hanabi had found them quickly enough. Naruto was fairly sure that they were mourning in their own way, and wasn't sure if he should interrupt. After all, no matter how bad he felt for him, he hadn't ever had a father, at least not one that he could remember, so he wasn't sure if what he said wasn't a little harsh for her to hear. Sasuke and Itachi also had some catching up to do, though he was under Tsunade's watchful eye, and seemed to be taking some kind of medicine that was making his nose bleed. He was sitting on a rock, overlooking the camp when Sasuke found him. He was followed by Sakura and the others. How's Itachi? Naruto asked. Tsunade said she's going to talk to some of the Yamanaka. Until then, he's in custody. With Orochimaru. Naruto snorted. Even after what Jiraiya had said, the whole brainwashing thing still sounded crazy. We're going to challenge him again, Naruto said, watching as the sun disappeared behind the mountains that cut off Whirlpool from the rest of the world. Of course, Kimimaro said softly. I've got a few things to take care of, Sasuke muttered. We've never done something halfway before, Sakura said. Only I want to be prepared. There were some nods. What about Akatsuki? Haku asked. I think we should worry about that when it comes, Niji said, closing his eyes. Let's go back. Lee and Guy are going to come up here and start going insane training, and I don't want to be roped into joining them. They laughed a little bit, but the sound wasn't as confident as before. Naruto stood up and pumped his fist in the air. All right guys dash. And girls. Sakura called. And girls, Naruto nodded, we're not dead, and we're going to improve. Yeah, things didn't go the way we wanted the first time, but we didn't die, and we're going to get stronger. We've got the best part of Konoha with us, and we're going to keep running missions, and we're going to do it right under Danzu's nose. He knows we're there, and he knows that we're dangerous. And you know something, the rest of the world does too. We're just blown apart Konoha's little thing about how the old man was killed. He grinned. Besides, always remember. He who fights and runs away lives to see the light of day, the others chanted. Quit trying to make that inspirational, Sasuke muttered, rolling his eyes, but he was smirking. And the others were looking a little happier too. Naruto grinned and leaned back, as people started chatting a little bit, and something of the tension started to dissolve. It was the truth, Naruto thought, as they walked towards the camp, watching nightfall and the fires start to come up. There'd be a genjutsu to hide them pretty soon, and no one was going to know that they were there. They'd rise again, and they'd be better for it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a complete victory, and all their problems were solved. People had died for them, and some of them had been people that they'd known and cared about. But they were all alive, and somehow, just like always, from the time that they'd stowed away in a cart heading out of town, they would survive. Check the description for the links to the author.